Good afternoon, or evening, or morning to everyone in what we affectionately call Zoom Nation. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I am the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia. And I begin by situating myself and Columbia University on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape. We pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future rights and presence of the Lenni Lenape on their rightful homeland. For the past 29 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate for social responsibility in Black studies. Dr. Marable offered a prescient reminder in a New York Times article from 1998 that, quote, Black studies must utilize history and culture as tools by which an oppressed people can transform their lives and the entire society. Scholars have an obligation not just to interpret, but to act, end quote. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and New York City's rich history and culture. And now, in partnership with our Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, what we affectionately call IRAAS-AAADS, we continue to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the diasporic Black experience, like this year's special series, Black Counter Cartographies, co-sponsored by the Institute for Comparative Literary Study and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia. Conceived with my brilliant colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agar-Jones, Black Counter Cartography brings together in dialogue geographers and artists, poets and architects and scholars in a series of conversations exploring the spatial practices of life across the diaspora, but also how they construct what Dr. Mpho-Matsipa calls counter-cartographies of sociality, imagination, and liberation. Geographies encapsulate modernity's construction of space and time, subjected to the metrics of markets and politics. Within that sphere, the racialization of peoples of African descent has historically and continues to produce sites of extraction, exploitation, dispossession, abjection, and displacement. The field of Black geographies challenges these discursive formations and reimagines the cadences of everyday spatial practices. For our sixth and sadly final conversation in the series, we couldn't think of two people whose work engages the Black counter-cartographic imaginary between sites around the continent, within the diaspora, within the city, within the interior of domestic space, then poet-scholar Dr. Tonya Foster and Dr. Elleza Kelley. So joining me in this conversation is my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agar-Jones, assistant professor of anthropology here at Columbia University, where she is affiliated with the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender, and the Center for Science and Society. At its most expansive, Dr. Agar-Jones's work asks how coloniality is made material in social forms, in human and non-human bodies, and in the landscapes in which we live. With a focus on Black life in the Atlantic world, she conducts historical and ethnographic research on racialization, environmental crisis, and the politics of gender and sexuality. She is a 2005 MA graduate of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. So I will turn it to Vanessa to introduce Drs. Foster and Kelley.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilson, our newest Guggenheim recipient, who we are so glad to celebrate today alongside the folks who are joining us for our final conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us. Excuse the frog in my throat. So I'm here to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. Dr. Tonya Foster is a poet, essayist, and Black feminist scholar. Dr. Foster is the George and Judy Marcus Endowed Chair in Poetry at San Francisco State University. She is the author of A Swarm of Bees in High Court, the bilingual chapbook, La Grammaire des Os, and co-editor of Third Mind, Teaching Creative Writing Through Visual Art. Her writing and research focus on poetry, poetics, ideas of place and emplacement, and on intersections between the visual and the written. Forthcoming publications that we're all very excited about include poetry collections Thingifications from Ugly Duckling Press, and a 2-volume compendium of the Umbra Writers Workshop, and an anthology of experimental creative drafts. Dr. Elleza Kelley is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English at Yale University. Dr. Kelley works on African American literature with an emphasis on Black geographies and radical spatial practice in the United States. Her current research traces how Black spatial knowledge and practice appear in literature and art, particularly through experimentations with form, genre, and media. Her first book project looks at practices of inscription and mark making as modes of spatial production, representation, and reinvention. Kelley's second project explores Toni Morrison's theories of place and geography, which she has written about in Antipode, a radical journal of geography, and her other writing can be found in The New Inquiry, Cabinet Magazine, and elsewhere. Please join me in a big digital Zoom Nation welcome for Drs. Foster and Kelley.
Hello. I'd like to start with a poem. Thank you so much for that welcome, for the opportunity to join all of you here. This is a poem titled Hood Hauntings, a poem in on progress. At this hour, standing here among you, on this bit of earth that is our momentary lot, I want to say that the self is not to a single body bound. Earth is, after all, a planetary constellation, pushing past our cautiously corralling calculations. I want to say that the self is not to a single body bound. The tender way she holds her lover's scarf tells us everything she won't say about his touch, about her quiet wanting. I want to say that the self is not to a single body bound. In the gentle way the bearded addict folds his lanky arms across his torso, ashen is a semaphore for what we cannot hold. I want to say that the self is not to a single body bound. The doubter situated as he is at road forks and rivers, dreams and circuits of certainty that can only short circuit one such as he. I want to say that the self is not to a single body bound, and the optimist has never seen the schist for the moss, and the pessimist refuses to see the sky beyond the mind, and refuses to see that was is not always, and that is not will be. I want to say that the self is not to a single body bound. And the loner who knows this cries to her self-wrought of words and worries. She hunkers down with her arms full of absences, more bearable than the gregariousness of neighbors. What is an I without you or them? Say I, therefore. To say that the self is not to a singular body bound is to dream in real time, talk is a cosmic conjuring of past the metal fences, past the clipped and cultivated lawns, past today's neighborhood congregants, past the omnipresent past. There's no way of filtering out. To say that the self is not to a singular body bound, is to make space for the girl, become lover, become mother, who breathes for a time for another, is to embrace that each I is only in the company of we, even if only an idea of we. And myself is not a single body, is not a body singularly situated among stars, among things, among thoughts, among words, among syllables, among shopping carts, among breaths and boxes. Myself is not by my body's boundaries bound only. In the thicket, we are. I am because we are. And we are mostly spirit, salve and machete. Greetings to those known and unknown, to those breathing, and to those who are merely air, merely dust, and thought or unthought, to all those that I'm encountering in this moment, in this or perhaps some other dimension of space, time, possibility. Hello, Mabel and Vanessa, and thank you for this invitation to think with the brilliant Elleza about various ways of mapping there, here, other wheres that are central to Black life and being. I am the eldest of 4 daughters. And I'm going to try to share these pictures with you. I am the eldest of 4 daughters, born in a brief Midwestern sojourn in Bloomington, Illinois, to Barbara and Spencer, who are children of the South city of New Orleans. I'm from a clan of Louisianians from way back on both the matrilineal and patrilineal lines. Lineage is important here because of how the genetic, biological, familial, and geographic form and inform and deform the cellular and social structures that make of each an I, a me, a we, a you, a them, a they, a chorus, cacophonous, harmonious, delving, observant, spiritual, psychological. It is also important for tracking movement across space. Now, I was raised largely among women, among sisters, Chanda, Dee, Bree, among a phalanx of grandmothers, of girl cousins and aunts and best friends. This matters because of the gendered forms of joy, of refusal, of survival, of making ways out of no ways, out of not knowings, out of knowing otherwise, out of love despite, out of spiteful love that suffuse my writing and my living and are the central sites of investigation for much of my work. What are the ways that, as Fannie Lou Hamer points out, a Black woman's body was never hers alone? What is the map that designates the limits of her body, the limits of her? Now, here I'd like to share a story of my first trip abroad when I was 20 years old. In the months after I decided that I was going to spend my junior year abroad, I received regular phone calls from my maternal grandmother explaining why I couldn't go to Germany. Daily, she would tell me about various things that were happening in Germany and that it was dangerous. My family was concerned. We were working class. And at 20, I didn't quite understand the need to keep me home and keep me safe. Once it was clear that I was hard-headed and that I was going, despite the warnings, despite the reasonings, my family and my community decided to hold a supper to raise money for me. That meant that there was the circle of my family. Extended beyond that were the places where my mother and my aunts and various people worked. People donated food. My grandmother, mother, sister, my mother's sisters cooked suppers and sold suppers to send me, the knucklehead, abroad. And that there was a sense that I was not going alone, that I was carrying them with me. So I wanted to share that first, but New Orleans is, of course, significant to my writing as a city that is formed and informed and necessarily malformed by the spiritual, psychological, and material effluvia that impact a body and place that exist always in the wake and consciousness and subconscious operations of Congo Square, my work's conceptual triggering ground. Years ago, when I moved to New York State, tri-state area, after years of living in the flat and minimally sidewalk land of Houston, Texas, an idea of love trounced momentarily MFA pursuits. It was the mid-90s before iPods and the absorbing ubiquity of smartphones, when Sony Walkmans were the technological rage, and I had already been writing and reading with writing in mind for years. In those early, still unemployed stranger days, as we, the socio-temporal collectivity which each eye is forced to inhabit and navigate, mastered the art and technologies of being alone together. I walked around Brooklyn. I, living at the time in Boston, had seen Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing in 1989 when it premiered, and knew something. I thought, imagine via Lee, of Brooklyn. Walked along the Fulton Mall, listening to the cadences of what and who were around me. The Brooklyn soundscape was an early introduction to life in the New York I had imagined living in since I was a girl, pronounced too skinny in certain quarters because nobody likes a bone but a dog, who imagined a host of elsewheres for the southern, not southern enough sounding person that I have always been. At home as a girl, when I spoke, I was often asked, "Where are you from?" As though New Orleans hadn't trained my tongue and ears at the sonic, cadence, and cellular levels. I speak with the rhythms and cadences of my young mother, youngest daughter of the youngest daughter of an Orleans-born daughter of a woman and man, sold into the area via Congo Square, one of the public spaces from which they were to be excluded, along Bayou St. John, called La Place Congo, where enslaved and free Africans from a range of cultures, languages, given under Code Noir, Sundays off, living in 18th century Louisiana under Spanish and later French colonial province, gathered. According to the description of one writer, the African slaves meet on the green by the swamp and rock the city with their dances, bodies. What I suspect is that there's the rich melange of languages and accents and the drumming that would roll out across time and circumstance. There's a South of the South lulling in language and rhythm and possibilities and realities of encounter. I speak with a voice, the dynamics of my mother-descended daughter reading poetry to me in my head, in my heart, in my day-to-day going. Barbara and Congo Square are the ever-present baselines to my work. And are the ever-present baselines to my work. So I wanted to talk a bit about that polyvocality that is also, for me, a kind of, it's a polyvocality that's about multiple valences, but is also about multiple locations. And the possibility of this intersection, not a collapsing of time and space, but an expansion of time, space, and place such that you encounter the work of art might be a moment of encounter. This is an excerpt from something called Monkey Talk, a project of mine that I hope I will at some point have time to finish. It's imagined as a series of phone conversations that are recorded by the FBI. The conversations are between Queen Kong, and imagined, the names for the characters come from the 1933 film King Kong. And Queen Kong is a Southern writer, Black Southern writer. And there's a white philanthropist who hopes to present her work. He wants to be her patron, but he's suspicious of her Blackness, of whether she is truly Black. And some of the questions that come up for this are, what are the ways and whys that Blackness gets articulated, and where does it get articulated? So this is just a little excerpt from, I'll try to skip over my reading.
Train.
These are other people.
3 tongues which dictate the wills and ways of the city. You're going to have to give me something more than that. Authenticity is real important here. I'm going out on a limb. It has to be for something real.
Denham's parents were founding members of New York's Progressive Labor Party. Although as an adult, Denham has at no time been an active member of the party, he has maintained contact with individuals who are active participants.
And let me also explain, there are sets of dueling footnotes at the bottom of the fake transcriptions. And the dueling footnotes are between Sojourner Williams, a Black PhD student who's investigating Kong's evolving poetics, and FBI agent Jack Driscoll, who is following the white philanthropist, but then becomes obsessed with Kong and ultimately writes a book called Treachery at Home, A Woman Named Kong. And so, see.
Address and desire that I learned. As a child, speak when spoken to. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. No white after Labor Day. As an adolescent, boys who go to private Catholic schools are desirable.
We know that the city's archdiocese is pretty strict and has a.
And so this is the work. And so the final thing I'll turn to is just that this is Swarm of Bees in High Court, which attempts to draft a sort of biography and a cartography of a particular block in Harlem through the voices of that place. And it's the range of voices to me that become the kind of tell us where we are, tell us when we are, and map the place for us. And I will stop there.
Hi, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Tonya. Thank you also to Mabel and Vanessa for inviting me. Thank you to the audience for tuning in, and very, very special thanks to Tonya, of whom I'm a very big fan, great admirer, and whose work has helped me to think a lot about space, mapping, and navigation and language over the last really 8 years. So I'm just really excited to be in conversation with you all today. I have a bunch of papers, which is why I seem scattered. And maybe I am a little bit scattered, but so it goes. So today I think that I will talk a little bit about my own work, and then talk a little bit about my work on Tonya's work, just sort of as a way of transition or kind of point of connection. But as I promised Tonya earlier, I'm going to try not to be too much of a fangirl about her. So I work broadly on theories of space and place in Black literature and art. I've published an article that more or less tries to read Beloved as a map, right? And think about mapping the unmappable. In that case, sort of the cartography of fugitivity in the novel. That's what I'm looking at. But for the most part, I think across scales and forms of spatial production and representation, not just about mapping. So my book project, which is tentatively titled Flight Lines, A Poetics of Black Space, articulates a theory of Black spatial practice, the unique and specific modes of perceiving, engaging with, and transforming the built and unbuilt environment that are expressed and preserved in Black cultural production. The focus of my book is not Black architects, planners, or cartographers, but rather Black communities and Black subjects whose engagements with their surroundings might constitute a critique of Western space, right? To sort of repurpose Cedric Robinson's assessment of Black studies as a critique of Western civilization. As critique, these engagements with space are responses, refusals, reconfigurations, revisions, correctives, expansions, and even reproduction sometimes. They are not monolithic, the freedoms they seek do not all look the same, and sometimes conflict with and contradict one another. I'm interested chiefly in how these critiques, these revisions and reconfigurations, take up the plantation and its spatial legacy in the United States in particular. So with that in mind, I trace the plantation and its spatial legacy, the post-plantation, as a cluster of spatial technologies and operations that shift and adapt in order to sustain racial capitalism's extractive project. Each chapter moves through this evolution and reconstitution of plantation geography, from enclosure, partition, and parcellation to the carceral architectures of neighborhoods produced through what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment. At each phase, moving from the 19th to the 21st centuries, I approach this spatial history through works by Black writers and artists that offer critical cartographies, alternative spatial representations of real places they've lived or spent time in, remembered, or had an intimate relationship to. Cleveland, Baltimore, Eatonville, Florida, Sparta, Georgia, Charlotte, Bronzeville, and Harlem, to name a few. But these works don't just try to accurately portray those places. They also preserve how Black communities did not simply accept the spatial operations and technologies of racial capitalism, but revised and transformed and sometimes co-produced them through acts of repurposing, reassembly, transposition, rearrangement, annotation, restaging, and beyond. As I move through these spaces in the book, gathering marks, cuttings, carvings, ephemeral and improvised performances, I also move through spatial forms, so from the fence, the train, the block, the apartment, and the rooftop. I'm going to talk a little bit about the block, which is where I rely upon sort of the theorizations of Tonya's brilliant book, A Swarm of Bees in High Court, which she just ended with, so it's a kind of perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about. And as she describes, I too read this work as critical cartography, right, as a critical cartography of Harlem, and which she calls, quote, a biography of life in the day of a particular neighborhood, end quote. So I won't rehash the entire chapter of the book, but what I do in the chapter is try to stage a conversation between Langston Hughes, Romare Bearden, and Tonya, where I read their works through one another, layering them, rotating them like a kaleidoscope almost, right? Mapping what overlaps, but also what doesn't quite match up, right? Those points of disconnection and divergence. Part of my book's argument is that Black spatial practices demand and produce new modes of reading and study. So that's part of what I'm experimenting with in these readings. So I try to read literature and art together and through one another as dynamic and shifting overlays that deepen and complicate our knowledge of a single place. So I guess sort of what I'm trying to do is take a soil sample, right? Or make a section drawing, right, of the block by dwelling with the art and writing that has been made to represent it over time. So here is Bearden's The Block, 1971, where this relationship between the fragmentation of the urban grid plan that produces the block and the rearrangement and reassembly of Black communal formation and Black spatial practice is sort of dramatized, right? This is a work of collage, so fragmentation is kind of both material and conceptual and symbolic here. So in the chapter, I try to stage this conversation about the block, specifically the block in Harlem. And when I say the block, I mean a whole bunch of blocks. I'm talking about a particular and particularly, but not exclusively, Black spatial form, a form that is taken up and taken over and claimed by Black communities. But it's a spatial form that begins as the byproduct of urban parcellation of the grid plan. So it's the product of this effort to make communities legible and orderly to the state, to sustain the project of racialized management and extraction. But in practice, the block becomes this extension of living space in Black communities like Harlem that we don't see in predominantly white areas of the city. What is the portrait of the block? Who maps the block and how? We can locate any given block on a map, but it wouldn't tell us anything about how the space of the block is used, perceived, imagined, and produced. It wouldn't document the life of the block. So what might a critical or counter cartography of the block look like? How can we see block life? I looked to Black artists and writers who were doing that, who had mapped those unmappable parts of the block's social production. There's already really an abundant kind of mapping of the block in sound, in music, rap music specifically. But I wanted to think in this chapter about flat forms and how the expression of the block spatiality shows up formally in work where artists express an intention to capture the particularities of place. And what I found in this kind of kaleidoscopic reading of Tonya's work with Bearden and Hughes is this relationship between fragmentation and assemblage and the block, right? The block as part of a repertoire of spatial responses to the fragmentation of parcellation and partition, that post-plantation geographic operation, right? That terraforming and subdivision of racial capitalism. In this way, I try to suggest that Bearden, dealing kind of explicitly with fragmentation and reassembly in his collage paintings, helps us read Foster and Hughes, who are thinking about the poetic and grammatical fragment and modes of reassembly as montage, permutation, and swarm, a kind of coming together that refuses wholeness or fusion, but shows its joints, its fissures, its variegations. And in turn, I suggest Foster and Hughes help us read back Bearden. The stoop, the street corner, and the block figure heavily into Foster's 2015 book, A Swarm of Bees in High Court. In the explanatory note, kind of brief note in the back titled Titular Lineage, Foster describes this text and its title as emerging from a collecting practice. The title comes from a painting by Max Ernst called A Swarm of Bees in the Palace of Justice, which Foster adapts, right? Because, as she notes, there are no surviving palaces or much talk of palaces in Harlem. There is a basketball court. There is constant courting on stoops and corners. There is the etiquette of courtship. There is the train to the courthouse. There are the nearby cops who card neighborhood congregants. There is the height of the hills, the height of the apartment buildings, the height of the cameras focused on streets and doorways in the small St. Nicholas Park. I began to think about and collect the language of the place, the people and things that occupy the place. This is a biography of life in the day of a particular neighborhood. The cameras, bodies, televised portrayals, voices, and doorways of the place demanded a different pronoun for dealing with the multiple as subject and as swarm of actors. Langston Hughes's portrayal of the block across the exploded fragments of Montage of a Dream Deferred similarly evokes, quote, the multiple as subject and as swarm of actors. I really like that line. And I think the poem that Tonya just read really speaks to that line as well. Montage is a book-length poem composed of 87 individually titled poems, which range in length from just over a page to short fragments. A poem called Warning is just 3 lines long. Daddy, don't let your dog curb you. The poetic fragments in Montage are themselves fragments or snatches, right, of Harlem days and nights, interior meditations and worries, chatter, scolding, solicitation, flirtation. Hughes dilates in and out of closeness and scale, just as he circulates through characters, locations, narrative voices, and forms of subjectivity. Sometimes he is one voice of many, sometimes many voices in one. So we find ourselves teleported into the middle of ongoing conversations and negotiations, the everyday business that both precedes and exceeds this text, gossip, advice, the intimate news, deliverance. Here all form the soundscape of street life in Harlem. Where the grid meant to render the chaotic reality of human life legible, orderly, and subject to state power, block life reaffirmed its multiplicity, its alternative orders and logics. Read alongside Montage, however, Foster's work offers a productive node of disconnection, one that generatively augments the fragmentation of Hughes's block map. In part because the position from which the speaker perceives, engages with, and thus represents the space of the block is different from Hughes's. Not only is Foster writing in a different time, but her narrator's position brings into relief the gendered production of the block. This question of position is drawn out by her attention to preposition and conjugation, the power relations that adhere within grammar, the parenthetical, the subordinate clause, right? But also the possibility, the slash between words that augments and expands their meaning, that multiplies subjectivity as it cuts. And I'm showing this page from the book that I think shows some examples of that. Written almost 65 years after Montage, block life in A Swarm of Bees has not changed so much, but there are perhaps more available narratives of experiences differently positioned within and around and through the block. By 2015, however, the block certainly has emerged as a colloquial geography, recognizable even outside of Black communities. In part, this is because of the emergence of rap music, right, narrating block life. What we do not see clearly in Montage is the block as a site of potential danger, both for the Black boys and men who primarily occupy it, neighborhood boy, Foster writes, corner boy, man to be, bin, bones, and for the women who might be harassed on its stage. They say bitch and mean when she walks by, seeming to think thoughts blind to them. Block boys trying on the tongues of men. The specter of gendered violence that haunts the block is also state violence. Here, while the first set of bodies of young men appear immobilized by death, the second set live as fixed and frozen works of art. The joint created by the third M- announces a list of the multiple sites in which young men might be installed. Yet, the set is limited, enclosed, discrete. One site is a different kind of enclosed block, the cell block. The enclosures of the cell block mark every corner in A Swarm of Bees, not only through their shared geometries of disciplinary oppression and management, but through their literal material entanglements, the informal commerce of the street corner, both real and imagined, render it a site of policing, surveillance, and violence. Unlike that of Montage 6 decades earlier, the Harlem of A Swarm of Bees is a site haunted by the decimations of mass incarceration and the pervasive infrastructure of the prison industrial complex. Violence here is both charted by spent casings that graph and by the carceral architectures of prison and ghetto. While the sociality and joy of Block life is apparent across all three texts, Foster's poetry holds and bears the weight of this more complicated picture. Foster's insomniac narrator, who mostly just wants to sleep, offers another possible reading of Block life in its refusal of partitions between private and public. Block life may reject the enclosures and partitions of the urban grid, but it is not without its own divisions and barricades. She wants a sleep, Foster writes, shut against the neighborhood, graffiti of noise. Here, the speaker articulates a desire for a kind of enclosure against the block. In addition to sound, the optics of the block disturb the narrator. And Harlem, Foster writes, she can't get the bedroom dark enough to lose sight of things. This haiku-like fragment is paired with another right below it. And Harlem, she can't get tour buses of eyes to stop trailing through her thoughts. Here, the dull irritation of visibility is both the existential persistence and insistence of the outside world and the exploitative gaze of the invading tourists penetrating the neighborhood. On the block, too, looking seems to be the primary mode of exchange. To see and to be seen is what it is to live on perennial blocks. To see and to be seen as somehow familiar. Friend A says, they see my clothes, think I got cash. Here, the block is a site of measurement, assessment, surveillance, difference, and as friend A suggests, potential exploitation. Here, the site and site of the auction block is perhaps unavoidable. While block life may function often as a kind of commons or informal public gathering space, it can also be a territory, a site of ownership, occupation, and exploitation, where not all members of a community, let alone outsiders, are welcomed. Seeing for Foster is perhaps what hearing is to Hughes. The productive distortion that turns perception into poem, what he calls a disc-torsion, you can see that in the last line of this intro to Montage. A disc torsion, right? A sonic effect. Montage is marked by chatter, interruption, singing, comment, calls and responses, while the multiplicity of Black life for Foster is coded in the page, in the visual glyphs and marks of punctuation that distort through notational operations, both magical and mathematical, both the wholeness and the singularity of a word or phrase. A swarm of bees in high court thus contains multitudes within its flat surface, multitudes that perhaps withhold from a voyeuristic public, from a surveilling eye. The coded exclamation of Hughes's noisy corners here becomes the coded sublimation of the interior, of the woman home alone searching for quiet, bringing the noisy outside into a site for contemplation. Both books collect small fragment-like poems as a way of representing an ecology, a constellation, a system of experiences, stimuli, and perception. But they also gather multiple positions and perspectives, bringing them together in a single space. Significantly, these positions and perspectives, though part of a collective totality, cannot be conflated with one another, but rather appear alongside each other, vibrating in harmonious disharmony. Entanglement, both texts caution, does not mean sameness. The effect of the poem's small unit form is perhaps most evident in Foster's paired haikus, which we see in this example and here too. Here, bits of text echo across the horizontal axis of the page like a reflection in water. However, like a ripple's distorting effect, they always repeat with modifications. These imperfectly matched pairs recall the misaligned panels of the block, of Bearden's The Block, which speak to the dynamism and improvisation and the gaps and slippages present always in Black life and within Black communities, constantly trying to produce ourselves as unities under the partitioning duress of racial capitalism. In a swarm of bees, slippages and gaps are not only between genders and classes, between men and cops, between insomniacs and sound sleepers. Foster also attends to a diasporic and multi-regional presence that defines Harlem. Foster places provenance alongside questions of perception, of love, of property relations and knowledge production. From is made into a place, much like the colloquial geography of the Black. But place is more than place. It is a mode of apprehension. The cardinal hive, she writes, through which are looking flies, and a lodestone. Both the cardinal, as in direction, and the lodestone, right, of which the first compasses were made, point to mapping operations that function in relation to the human body. In other words, tools that allow one to perceive where they are in space. As such, the point of origin is always carried in us and transported to such a space of gathering and immigration, in/migration, as Harlem. We might even imagine Foster's many theirs, right? And I'm calling attention to the T/here, right, there, as the site of immigration, where here's might mean the South, might mean the Bronx, might mean where your people stay. But what is in us is also between us. The edge of misaligns and jammed and stretched across two lines shifts the weight of the poem's shape, misaligning it visually and perhaps sonically. But this misalignment seems to also make possible love and connection through friction, touching, translation, reading and treading, right? Water or ground. We might say Foster gestures towards something like what Brent Edwards has named décalage. Décalage is not merely a gap or slippage, however, but indicates the reestablishment of a prior unevenness or diversity that defines diaspora, a differentiation and variegation that was always there. Just as the swarm is a figure of entanglement without sameness, of murmuration without uniformity, so décalage is a changing core of difference. It is the work of differences within unity. The slippage present here for Foster is one that exceeds geographical difference, yet is rooted in it. And she asks if perhaps the home place is what makes and unmakes all other places. Thank you.
Wow.
Both of you are fantastic, mind blown. I don't know what to say other than thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to be here and talk to Tonya and talk to both of you and share some of that in-process work.
Well, thank you so much for that reading of my work. I don't even know what to say, you know?
Say I'm wrong, I might be wrong.
Well, it's funny that I carried around for a long time this quote from Italo Calvino in Invisible Cities, where Marco Polo talks about Venice as the city through which is the home city, and it's always the city and all these other descriptions. And there's some way that I think of New Orleans as fundamentally that for me. And yet I'm always wondering if it isn't an idea of New Orleans, more so than it is the actual New Orleans, because the New Orleans I knew isn't anymore and can't be. So that sense of how home separates us is in us. And
yeah, I think one of the things that interests me about the idea of a critical cartography, right, or perhaps a counter cartography, is that it would allow us to map the actual New Orleans as the one that is in our heart, in our memories, right? That it doesn't restrict our definition of place to these positivist conceptions of place as being, you know, what's here, what's now, what's physical. But it can also account for what used to be here, right? What was here before? Who was here before, right?
Right.
Who was displaced? Whose land was expropriated, right? So there's this way that an expanded sense of space and spatial representation allow us to be able to kind of claim that, right?
Absolutely, to claim that and to claim not only who was here before, because I worry that sometimes we get trapped in the like originary notion of value, and the original is somehow more legit. And that I almost feel we have to have more complex conversations about that when we think about, and we do. I mean, you know, when we think about belonging, when we think about, when we disarm ownership, and engage in ideas of what it is to live and be in a space and be an organism, right? And community as organism, place as organism. That necessarily changes, does not become monumentalized such that it's continually displacing.
Yeah, I love that. And I think too, that's why I'm interested in like, what does it mean to think about layering, right? And how layering allows us to have a kind of an approach to a site that is about depth, right? That's about, so not just what was there before, maybe like you're saying, but also what comes afterward. Right?
That's right.
The new things that are made and left behind, and how each kind of each interpretation of a home place changes that place.
Necessarily changes. And so what happens if we are responsive rather than reactive? Yeah.
I just want to ask, well, one, I'm curious about both layering in a haptic sense, not just a visual and a sonic, and how might we sort of think about the haptic. But I also want to go back to hood hauntings, Tonya, and maybe just talk about the self is not to a single body bound, and the question of individual, the liberal individual, right? Which, you know, my self-possession then maps onto the world, you know, as the land, my deed, my, you know, in terms of a kind of singularity. And what does it mean to start to not think about the self as singular, but multiple, the multiplicity? And what does that do for place, right?
Well, in my, you know, fantasies, what it does is it means that one person can't own 90% of the terrain. It challenges ideas of exclusive ownership. I think that's one of the things.
And I would offer to it refigures relations, right? This refusal of the liberal individual, the closed body. Part of what I'm so taken by between your two presentations is the openness of the body to the block and the block to the body, the kind of interpenetration of the two, the kind of the radical openness of the body and the ways that you all are talking about place and its relationship to time. Every space also always being a time, and every body also not only being a material kind of manifestation of all of the places it's traveled through, but all of the times it's also traveled through. And I do want to come back to Mabel's great question about layering in a haptic sense. What are the senses that get evoked in the layering that Elleza you're offering to us? Are there senses beyond the sonic, the visual, and the haptic that your work and its, you know, interimbrication brings us to? I kept thinking about attunement, so a kind of sense that is not a sensing, that is not a formal empirical sensing. Is it a different kind of sense making for place and for the beings that move through it.
I think it has to. And Elleza, you asked this question to Elleza, right, Vanessa?
You should answer. I'm thinking about your work together. So this is for both of you as you continue your gorgeous conversation.
I know, beautiful chorus.
I was just going to say that one, I think of Fannie Lou Hamer's "A Black woman's body is never hers alone," that there's the frightening level on which that, in which she means that. And then there's something else about how being embodied as a Black woman requires that you know in many ways. And that this is anecdotal. I remember I was in an MFA program, and I was walking through the hall one day, and it hit me. I thought, there is not room in this institution for all the ways I have of knowing. And that it wasn't about my knowing a lot. It was understanding that as a child of New Orleans, as a person growing up in a particular sort of cultural milieu, there was an understanding, there were other understandings of the world. And what poetry offers for me is the possibility of other forms of knowledge coming through that are not just grounded in ideas of certain kind of empiricism or, yeah.
Yeah, that's part of one of the many things I love about your poetry so much, and why I feel like your poetry is a site of theorization, right? Because it is deeply about other kinds of epistemologies, right? And ways of knowing. And I when I was first reading A Swarm of Bees in High Court, this figure of the swarm, right? The figure of the bees and being, and the way you play with that, with the sort of bees and the being, it seems so important to this possibility, right? To the idea that you could kind of cut something up and make it yield more, right? Make it give up things that even you may not be intending for the meaning of the poem, right? But that there were these other ways to create knowledge and create meaning, right? And create signification. And this kind of sense of an infinite opening, right? For these new relations to come through. And in that way, I think, we get that sense of this kind of epistemological aberration or escape, right? Or something that gets away from us when we only try to approach this poem from the kind of standpoint of conventional poetic reading, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always been for me a sense, and there are a lot of other artists, writers, I lived in a very noisy block in Harlem for a long time. And one of the things I understood was that the guys on the stoop, the guys on the corner were theorizing the conditions of their lives.
Yep.
And that if you listened, you would hear that theorization. And so as a person going to grad school, I thought, well, I got to bring my crew with me, the crew I'm talking with, into these spaces where I could speak this language, but I think, why would I? Yeah. So.
Yeah, I just want to say to folks out there, please leave any questions that you have, please write them in the chat. And I'm sure Tonya and Elleza would, love to respond to any questions people may have.
I think I think it says to use the Q&A.
Oh, sorry, in the Q&A. Sorry, not the chat. Please put them in the Q&A, not the chat.
One of the things I meant to say earlier, Tonya, when we were talking about the sort of the home place and Calvino, was the way that New Orleans shows up in Harlem, right? In this Harlem book. And the parishes, right? And there's all of these moments where you do see that. And that's one of the things I was trying to get at with that second to last slide, was just the way that, you know, we're able to see Harlem. So we have kind of the body, the individual as swarm, right? The individual sort of consent not to be a single being. And then we have the idea of swarm as entanglement, right? As community. And then we also have the swarm that is Harlem itself, right? That Harlem itself is not a fixed, enclosed, siloed place, right? It is a place through which all of these other places, right, are coming together and existing and interacting. And so, yeah, I loved hearing your presentation and hearing about New Orleans and these kinds of the ways that places remain unstable and shimmering, right, and full of other wares, right?
And who has had to be aware of that? Who has had to sort of pack up and carry their home with them or make home elsewhere? Yeah, again and again. It's really beautifully put, Elleza.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat. I'm blown away by this excellent discussion. Can each of you talk more about fragmentation? And thank you, Melody, Hunter, Pilian. Dr. Wilson, your monograph, Negro Building, was one of my favorite books on my comps list. Thank you. You're welcome. But yeah, can each of you talk more about fragmentation?
Sure. I'll let Tonya go first.
You know, I'm very interested in chaos theory, and the ways that the idea rather, and not that I fully understand it or whatever, but the sense that if you have a small enough fragment or a large enough section, you can detect a pattern in what otherwise seems random. And that idea for me of perspective, right? Of there always being a sense that there is not a wholeness that we can grasp entirely. We can detect patterns within the wholeness. So that interests me. I'm also very interested in the changing same. The appearance that it is hitting the same note and the variation. I was also taught to listen to jazz by Ellis Marsalis. Listen to jazz so that I could write about it. And that feels relevant to detecting the pattern in what is improvised or fragmented, that there is nonetheless a kind of through line or several. Yeah.
So the chapter that I sort of read a little bit from, some parts from, is a lot of it is about fragmentation, and I'm thinking in particular, not just about fragmentation the way that I think Hughes is thinking about it as this sonic sort of through jazz, through bebop, right? As this sonic phenomena, but also, you know, Hughes is written something called montage of a dream deferred, not collage, right?
That's true.
Montage implying something that's been sort of smoothed over, right? Those edges are not coming up in the way that when we look at the Bearden, right, we see these intentionally sort of offset, right? These misalignments. That's why I love that enjambment of that line, Tonya, the misalignments, right? There's this way that there is this kind of not an insistence that fragmentation means broken, right? But that fragmentation is a kind of condition under which, you know, we live and produce our identity. And the way that we put those pieces back together is not to make them whole again, right? But to make something new with them, you know? And so I think one of the thinkers that I rely a lot on in this chapter is Elizabeth Alexander, who is taking kind of the Bearden collage as its own sort of paradigm. And she says that the Bearden collage gives us a way to think about the complexities of African-American identity. And for her, this is a revision of double consciousness, right? So this idea that double consciousness is this kind of split, this violent fragmentation. What if double consciousness was a doubling, right? What if double consciousness was multiplicity, right? Yes. And was actually a gift of second sight, right? Or rather than this idea of a kind of torn subjectivity. So I think Elizabeth Alexander has thought a lot about this in a really, really useful way. And actually, I have a little bit of this that I can read. She says, if the African-American intellectual consciousness is split, it is split multiply rather than doubly. That so-called fragmentation, arisen from the fundamental fragmentation of the Middle Passage, has become a source of our creative power. The complex coexistence of a spectrum of Black identities in a single space, and that's where I get that little formulation, in a single space, right, represents a particular strength and coherence of African-American cultural production. So it's coherence, right? Fragmentation is coherence. Putting it back together is a kind of coherence. And so I really take that and kind of run with it. And that's why I'm using the block to then think about these other representations of the block and the ways that fragmentation and assemblage, right? Rearrangement and assemblage come up in poetic forms too, right? And that they speak to each other.
Elleza, can you please share that quote with me? I've been writing about double consciousness as multiplicity in something parentheticalities.
Oh, wow.
And I think
I want to talk to you about parentheses.
Let's talk about parentheses. I've written a whole essay in which the parenthetical is central to the rest of the essay. But I love that. I also wonder about the place of illegibility within that space, so that it's not coherence such that it's legible, but what is it to cohere and maintain a certain level of illegibility that saves one's life?
Or legible to who, right?
And legible to whom? Yes.
Yeah, I want to maybe go back to the Black geography with that thought. Being trained in a field architecture that's very much about, you got to make your ideas literally legible on the page. Yeah. And it's often, it's the singular object. It's rarely contextual. It's exactly what you described, Elleza. It's always, I was thinking of the vessel, that development and planning, they make vessels that allow profit to be extracted. And it's just merely the residue in that world that never accounts for the lived, ever, 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 ever. And one of the things that taught me to really think differently, and I was desperate for it, was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And I've talked about that, the way she opens up with the Dick and Jane and the way in which she sees the text as space. And it taught me a whole other, it was just an epiphany about representation and what one can do exactly around illegibility. And so I'm wondering, you think very spatially, both of you, by looking at art, but also at the page. And so what could you tell, the folks out there, and especially our students, about why Black geographic thinking can be such a kind of positive space time of working, a way of working?
Elleza, you have to go first.
That's a big question. That's a question that I'm trying to write a book to answer, really. But I can just say kind of off the top of my head that, Black geographies, or I should say that I think Black geographies are about attention, right? About kind of both attention in geography to Blackness, right? And to Black life. And then attention also in our other fields, right? I teach students in literature often, and in addition to African-American studies and Black studies, but teaching our students in literature to attend to and pay attention to space and surroundings. In literature, and sometimes in art, but definitely in literature, we are taught that space is setting, and setting is inert, right? Setting is a container. Speaking of vessel, right? Setting is a container in which the important stuff happens, right? And so to read geographically, to pay attention to geography, and in particular Black geographies, which are deeply geographies of negative space, right? Geographies of, the margin, geographies of, the kind of hidden away, geographies of escape, right? There are all kinds of different geographies that resist the positivist ideas about space as protrusion, right? As kind of physical object. And so that kind of spatial attention can make students of literature better readers. It helps them to actually see all of the things that are going on underneath and at the edges of texts, right? That in some ways disturb those texts and critique those texts and upset those texts. Some of what Morrison is talking about, right? When she's talking about, the Africanist presence in American literature, right? Those things that are disruptive that already exist within the kind of dominant texts and yeah.
I mean, I'm with you. I also think of the ways that we are taught to view space. For some reason, I just imagine like landscape painting, right? How we're taught to understand land and not the ways in which we are producing space always in the living of our lives, right? And somehow it seems to me that attending to geographies and cartographies is, as you've said, about paying attention. And it's paying attention to how we are producing space.
Yeah.
And what that then means is that we have the possibility of producing other spaces which are less murderous, less oppressive, less brutal.
Yeah. Yeah. The malleability of space, right? The fact that we live in a spatial order that is only one of many, many different kinds.
And that's entirely received, is not natural.
Yeah.
So how do you break the sort of the acceptance of forms as given, particularly when we see that those forms are only functioning to produce profit, to distribute death, and distribute suffering? That wasn't my peppy ending. That
was a good ending.
It wasn't peppy though.
We do have another question in the Q&A, if you all wouldn't mind. This is from Nicole Kaplan Kelly, who says, Tonya Foster, you spoke about a New Orleans that doesn't exist for you anymore. Can you speak about finding or remaking home after reentry or significant rupture from home spaces?
I remember going back to New Orleans with my mom and my sisters after Katrina and going back in to see my mother's home, right, destroyed, and riding through the city and not being able to look directly at the city. So I had a camera. That's the way I could kind of bear the obvious destruction. But when I think of the New Orleans I grew up in, and there was a sense of New Orleans as being south of the South, more Caribbean in sensibility, that there was a sense that all the grownups on the block knew who you were and who you belonged to and would have something to say about what you did or would tell your mom, or your dad would, kind of tell on you, and everybody was a part of that sense of community. I think after Katrina, there was a pressure to make the city more American in ways that we're talking, what is it, 30,000 at least who could not return, affordable housing destroyed, as we saw an increase in the unhoused populations across the country. We then see, tons of people living under the bridge in New Orleans. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think where New Orleans has great food. So I make a point of I just made some red beans and rice. They were only kind of mediocre, but sometimes I make gumbo. There's the food. There's the sense of, you ask this question, and I think the community of friends and family that, always family. One is always from New Orleans if you're from New Orleans. There's kind of no getting it out of you. And that's so not a particular answer to your question. Yeah, I'm just kind of tending to the kind of images and thinking about that home that I knew, that home where we lived next door to Miss Myrtle, that home where we lived on Peniston Street in a house that was featured in one of the Candyman films later. Yeah, I don't know if this is relevant. Before Katrina, I would ask my family to drive me around New Orleans so I could take pictures of places we had lived, because my joke was that no one would believe these places had existed once the city was drowned. And it was a smart alecky thing to say. And so once the city was drowned, we spent some time going back to those places. And so I think a lot about what's lost, what's left. Yeah.
That would be a beautiful, poignant title, actually, to a book, Once the City Was Drowned. A book about those photographs, even.
Yeah.
So, putting that out there, Tonya. But we do have a question from Diogo Henriquez. Maybe more of a comment than a question. The literary and artistic duo Black Quantum Futurism have also been working very creatively with space-time manipulation and/or collapse of space-time, and also in related to counter cartographies and Black geographies. So I think it's more of a comment than a question, but thank you.
I wonder if there are any final burning questions from the folks gathered in Zoom Nation, or if each of you have questions for each other. I mean, the way that you organically flowed from speaking to our audience to each other as your talks finished was just so delightful. And I'm happy to be a fly on the wall to hear you continue your conversation with each other. If there are things that you've been wanting to ask or that still seem to be percolating about what each of you presented. I know we'd love to listen to the chat.
I am just so moved by how you've read the work and read the work in the context of other writers, painters. I mean, I'm floored by that. I think I've thought of it as a quiet little book. And so I'm very touched by that. And amazed at what you saw. Because I have been thinking a lot about place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and being emplaced.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for saying that. I mean, I was like, is this a good idea? Should I be just like this directly to Tonya? But you know, this is one of the texts that from the very beginning, early stages of my project, which used to be a dissertation not too long ago, it helped me to kind of think not just about what books do I want to write about, right? But also about what is my, what do I truly believe about this? What do I believe about place and space? And for me, part of the argument of the book is that we need to be looking to poets and novelists and artists, right? That actually that's where all of my theories of space and place come from, right? From Toni Morrison and from you, right? And from Bearden. And so in some ways, I think the book itself has helped me to navigate, right? It's really given me a kind of my own map to what this project is. And it's it is a quiet book, but quiet doesn't mean not hugely impactful and reverberational and just absolutely ground shifting, which is what I think the book is. So yeah, I really appreciate your feedback and being able to share it with you. And yeah, those weren't questions. We were just rushing.
We're just fangirling each other.
But I think, I think that's.
Yeah.
I have a question. Well, it's not a question. I want to talk about like parentheses. I'm interested in the parenthetical and the way that you use parentheses. And I mean, your interest in grammar is very, very spatial, right? It's something that I think is both kind of visually spatial in terms of giving us this kind of playing with the space of the page and of the sentence, but it has this swarm form that it's creating, right? It's creating all of this kind of depth and dimension in the page, right? And so we no longer have this flat page. We have this page that is full and brimming, right? With these different levels and layers and relationships between parts of language, right? Between punctuation and conjugation, preposition, right? Which is completely spatial, right? Is the kind of preposition. and the parenthetical, right? The kind of the aside, in some ways, right? The quieter voice. So yeah, I wonder, I would love to hear a little bit about what you're thinking in that essay and just about the parentheses in general.
I think part of it for me is that I was a very sarcastic kid. Right. So at some point, there were all the things I was thinking that I couldn't say.
Yeah.
And as I got older, there came a point where I could say them, but I wouldn't say them because it's not polite. But there has always been the sense for me that there are these thought bubbles, and hey, there's this way, this direction that this conversation or this sentence or this word could go. And so what is the space at? It's the space of the pivot where it could go one way or it could go another way. And so how I've become very interested in how one both marks the space of the pivot and signals myriad possibilities at the same time. So it's also, I think, I was very interested in an idea of jazz poetics that does not signal kind of jazz poetics as in jazzy language, but in the construction of the possible conversations that are going on within the tune. And so in this particular essay, I was working on an essay about influences. But as I wrote the essay about influences, I thought, well, if we're going to talk about influences, I can't just write about what I'm reading. I can't just write about what I'm listening to. There's also this going on at the same time. There's this kind of violence happening that I am aware of and thinking, okay, well, on the one hand, there's, Black majesty, but on the other hand, there's Black misery, and they occupy the same space. Now, they don't occupy it in the same way, but they are entangled. And so there's something in the parenthetical that lets me get at the space of entanglement. And that is also laughing at in that space of entanglement. And it's a kind of laughing to keep from dying.
Wow. And you know what? I mean, as you were just talking, I thought about the parenthetical as a mathematical notation, right? Of course it's simultaneity. Of course it's not just simultaneity, but entanglement, right? The way, I mean, I'm not that good at math, but I know PEMDAS, I know what the parentheses does, right? That it has this space of containment in some way, right? Where something else is going on that still allows it to be simultaneous to and engaged with, right? Entangled with, changing and transforming the other signs and figures, right? In an equation. So that's amazing.
Or crazy, or both.
Or both. Both.
And that's all necessary. So I just want to thank you both. This has really been wonderful. I mean, absolutely incredible conversation.
I also just wanted to note that this is totally by accident that I'm matching the book, but if anyone out there doesn't have this book, you better run and get this book. Period.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm so truly grateful to all of you for ending our series on such an incredible note. This is a conversation for the ages, and I'm thrilled that we were able to host it.
Thank you. Thank you both for having us. And I'm such a fangirl of all of you on this Zoom call. I heard you in Venice, and I know you, Mabel. So just saying.
You'll be hearing from us.
You will be hearing from us very soon. Don't worry.
Yeah.
You'll be hearing more from us.
Yeah. So I just want to say, I mean, kaleidoscopic, swarm, mapping the unmappable, the parenthetical to see the space of entanglement. Thank you both for sharing ways to be attentive to the sociality and intimacies of Black geographies. So I can't think of a better way. I agree with Vanessa in ending this series. And for folks who are interested in this series, you can find them on our YouTube channel. So this is the 6 actually of 5. But I always want to say thank you for the brilliance of my colleague, Vanessa Agar-Jones, and also, you know, gratitude has to go to the amazing Sharon Harris, our logistical queen, Sean Mendoza, who is behind the scenes, making this happen, and to our wonderful IRAAS assistant, Joshua Agabato, who's here today, but also Olivia Pearson and James Jennings, who are all essential to shaping today's events. But even though it is April, stuff ain't over for us. On April 11th, we have Mellon Arts Dialogue, which will be fantastic with Okwe Opokwesili and Saidiya Hartman. April 19th, we will be at the Schomburg for a Black Curators Matter, the Oral History Project Part 1. And so for more information about these and other events, please see our website, fmstudies.columbia.edu. So thank you to our audience for attending today, for your insightful questions, and please take care and be well. All right, that is it.